On the early morning of September 20th, 1944, precisely at 15 minutes past 6, Major Charles Carpenter found himself crouched beside his lightweight Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a small and nimble observation aircraft, parked on a muddy, rutted airstrip situated near the town of Arracourt in France. The ground beneath him was saturated from recent rain, and a thick veil of fog was slowly creeping across the surrounding fields and pastures. In the distance, he could see the shifting gray shrouds obscuring the landscape, making his visibility limited and uncertain. From his vantage point, he watched as the fog rolled across the open terrain, subtly cloaking the entire scene as German Panther tanks advanced relentlessly toward the trapped American troops, who had little room for escape. These formidable armored vehicles pressed forward with deadly purpose, their steel hulks moving steadily through the thick mist, inching closer to the encircled defenders. Major Carpenter, who was only 32 years old, had already accumulated a record of 47 combat missions during his service. His aircraft, a fabric-covered, lightweight observation plane powered by a modest 65-horsepower engine, had become his eyes in the sky. Normally, the role of aircraft like his was straightforward: to monitor enemy troop movements, spot targets for artillery, and return safely to base without engaging directly in combat. However, this morning, Carpenter was acutely aware that the situation was far more perilous. His aircraft, the L-4 Grasshopper, when built, weighed about 765 pounds when empty. Its maximum payload, including the pilot, was roughly 232 pounds, assuming he carried no radio and was alone in the cockpit. To his astonishment, he had installed 6 M9 Bazooka launchers, each mounted on the aircraft's wing struts, a daring and unconventional modification. Each of these launchers, weighing about 15 pounds, was loaded with a single M6A3 heat rocket, which added an additional 3 pounds each. With 6 rockets aboard, the total weight of munitions attached to the aircraft was 18 pounds. Doing the math, Carpenter realized that, with all these additional armaments, his plane was carrying nearly 90 pounds more than it was designed to handle safely. The weights and balances had been pushed well beyond recommended limits. Typically, other L-4 pilots in the region stayed at high altitude during reconnaissance missions, simply observing the battlefield from above and relaying coordinates to artillery units. Their minimal engagement with the enemy was based on the idea that these tiny aircraft, with their fragile construction, would be virtually ignored by German gunners, who considered them too small and insignificant to target. However, Carpenter's mindset had shifted over the course of nearly 3 months of intense observation. He had watched with grim focus as American tank crews were slaughtered beneath his gaze. His reconnaissance flights had revealed a brutal reality. The 4th Armored Division had already lost 48 Sherman tanks within the first 48 hours at Arracourt. The German Panther tanks, with their thick armor and powerful guns, could easily penetrate Sherman armor at distances as close as 200 yards. In contrast, American 75mm guns often required at least 300 yards to reliably hit and destroy these Panther tanks. Because of this, most Sherman crews were unable to get close enough to fire effectively, leaving them exposed and vulnerable during their attempts. On the morning of September 18th, the persistent fog that had settled before dawn played a sinister role. The German tanks took advantage of the cover to advance unnoticed, slipping through the dense mist to launch their attack. Carpenter took off at first light, his small aircraft piercing into the cold morning air, but the ground beneath him disappeared into a swirling, white nothingness almost immediately. He was forced to circle blindly for an agonizing 1 hour and a half, waiting for the fog to lift. When the mist finally parted in the late morning, he looked down to see the aftermath of the chaos he had missed. 11 American Sherman tanks were ablaze and sprawled haphazardly across the fields around the village of Lonville. He watched as crews abandoned their disabled vehicles, some making it to safety, others remaining trapped inside the burning steel coffins. One particular tank had sustained a direct hit on its ammunition storage. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, and it hurled the turret of the tank approximately 40 feet through the air, ending any hope of survival. Carpenter's eyes caught the loader, stumbling out of the wreckage with his uniform on fire from blast. The young soldier took only 5 steps before collapsing onto the ground, overwhelmed and injured, unable to continue. All Carpenter could do at that moment was to mark the precise location of the wreck and send the coordinates back to his command, reporting the tragedy unfolding beneath him. The next day, on September 19th, the situation grew even more intense. The German 113th Panzer Brigade intensified their assault, pushing through several American outposts near Arracourt. Over the course of that night, as the fighting raged on, German tanks, specifically Panthers, had destroyed or severely damaged a total of 43 American armored vehicles. The American tankers fought their battles from concealed positions, utilizing the natural terrain, hedgerows, hills, and vineyards to momentarily stay hidden and to launch surprise attacks. This strategy allowed them some measure of effectiveness, but it was only barely successful. Despite their efforts, the combat command was stretched thin across a 20-mile front of rolling farmland, and the relentless German advance showed no signs of abating. They kept pressing forward, determined to break the American defenses. 2 weeks prior to these events, Carpenter had learned about 2 American officers, Lieutenant Harley Merrick and Lieutenant Roy Carson. Both of them had mounted bazookas, rocket-propelled grenades, on their small observation aircraft, the L-4 Grasshoppers, and had succeeded in destroying 2 German trucks during a single mission. These trucks, while not as glamorous as tanks, represented a vital supply link for the enemy lines. The destruction of such vehicles was a significant operational blow. Their success fueled Carpenter's growing desire for a more potent form of combat capability, the kind of armament that could turn his fragile aircraft into a true weapon of war. He sought out an ordnance technician and a crew chief, determined to modify his plane further. Together, they quickly installed 3 M9 launchers on each wing, positioned just outside the jury struts and angled upward by 20 degrees. Electronic triggers were wired into switches within the cockpit, allowing Carpenter to choose between firing only 1 missile or unleashing a full salvo of all 6 at once. The crew chief, who was proud of their makeshift but effective modifications, affectionately named the aircraft Rosie the Rocketeur, a nickname that reflected both its new offensive capabilities and its small but powerful stature. This transformation turned Carpenter's reconnaissance plane into a small but aggressive weapon, capable of surprising the enemy and altering the tide of battles in the contested fields of France. The danger was immense. Every flight a gamble with death, but the potential reward, in terms of battlefield impact, made the risk justified in his eyes. Several experienced pilots dismissed such actions as nothing short of suicidal. If you're curious to find out whether Carpenter's innovative tactic, mounting a bazooka on a Grasshopper aircraft, could actually neutralize German tanks, then I invite you to observe the details closely. Your engagement by considering such a thought can help us bring to light many overlooked stories from the vast and complex history of World War II. Such stories are important because they reveal the daring and ingenuity of those who fought. Stories that deserve to be remembered and shared. Now, returning to Carpenter's remarkable adventure. The aircraft he flew was of the L-4 model, a light, nimble airplane with wings made from treated cotton fabric. On this particular day, the materials and equipment on board would be subjected to some of the harshest conditions imaginable. The rockets attached to his makeshift bazooka produced a fiery exhaust that could reach temperatures of about 200 degrees Celsius, a formidable blast that raised serious questions among testers and pilots alike. No one truly knew whether the wings of this fragile craft, so carefully covered in fabric, would ignite under such intense heat. Also uncertain was whether the overloaded Grasshopper, burdened with extra weight and armament, would be able to pull out a steep dive if something went wrong. After all, this was untested in actual combat scenarios. There was no previous mission to guide him or guarantee success. It was early in the morning, on the 20th day of September, enveloped in thick fog that clung heavily to the landscape, obscuring everything below. From his vantage point high above, Carpenter observed German tanks advancing through the mist, appearing suddenly and threatening American positions. Alone in his cockpit, with no observer or radio operator to assist him, he relied solely on his own judgment and his compact arsenal of 18 rockets, each with the potential to change the course of the battle. The engine roused with a couple of coughs before finally roaring to life, a critical moment of tension and hope. Once the engine was steady, Carpenter released the brakes, and the heavily laden Grasshopper lurched forward on the runway, ready to face whatever awaited beneath the fog. By the time noon approached, it was clear that Carpenter's fate hinged on one of two outcomes. Either he would be killed in the line of fire, or he might, through his daring and skill, redefine the tactics used by the Cub pilots. The tiny aircraft, with its engine humming steadily at about 75 miles per hour, roughly 120 kilometers per hour, began climbing through the dense fog at a modest rate of about 400 feet per minute. Although its maximum climb rate was approximately 600 feet per minute, the additional weight of the rockets and the heavy modifications slowed its ascent somewhat. As Carpenter reached an altitude of roughly 1,500 feet, he paused, surveying the bleak, white expanse stretching beneath him. No land features or landmarks were visible, only an endless field of white clouds and sky extending out ahead and below. After throttling back to a steady cruise speed, he allowed the engine to settle into a low, consistent drone, a steady hum that wouldn't alert enemy forces to his presence. The aircraft's fuel tank held about 12 gallons, enough to sustain roughly 3 hours of continuous flight, meaning he had left his takeoff point at approximately 6:42 in the morning. By 9:30, the fog stubbornly persisted, still shrouding the battlefield in its thick embrace, refusing to lift. Handling the aircraft with the Bazookas mounted proved a significant challenge. The added weight and the drag introduced by the launchers caused the Grasshopper to respond sluggishly to pilot commands. Unlike the lighter, more nimble versions Carpenter had flown during artillery spotting missions earlier in the war. Testing out shallow banking maneuvers, Carpenter discovered that the aircraft responded more slowly and less predictably than usual. When he pushed the nose down by about 5 degrees to adjust his trajectory, he was met with creaking sounds from the fabric wings, which strained against the wind. The Bazooka tubes, angled upward at 20 degrees from the horizontal plane, caught the wind, tugging at the aircraft structure. This was no longer a gentle, docile aircraft performing delicate reconnaissance. It had become heavier, more aggressive, and potentially more dangerous to operate under stress. By approximately 9:53 in the morning, the thick fog, aided by rising breezes, started to break apart in patches, revealing glimpses of the landscape below. Through these openings, Carpenter was able to make out the ground, fields, patches of forest, the winding Rin Canal reflecting the gray sky above. At this point, he descended to around 1,000 feet and began a systematic search pattern, moving from north to south, then east to west, carefully scanning for any sign of German armored units. Intelligence indicated that the combat command of the 4th Armored Division had established defensive positions around the towns of Arracourt and the nearby villages, including Juval to the north, Monner to the south, and Bzanj-Liapit to the east. The German forces had launched multiple attacks from different directions, aiming to encircle the American units, forcing Carpenter to locate where the enemy was gathering for their next offensive push. At approximately 11 o'clock and 7 minutes in the morning, the fog finally lifted enough to clearly see the roads below. Carpenter's gaze quickly picked up movement, indications of enemy activity. Approximately 3 miles northeast of Arracourt, he spotted the distinctive silhouette of German Panther tanks, although the exact number remained uncertain. Probably 6, or perhaps 7, some partially concealed by nearby tree lines. Accompanying them were armored cars moving swiftly alongside the tanks, with infantry units following on foot, advancing steadily southwestward toward the American positions. Carpenter carefully checked his remaining fuel, enough for a single attack run, with an additional estimated hour and a half reserved for his return to base in case the mission needed to be aborted or delayed. He knew the capabilities of his weaponry well. The M9 bazooka had a maximum effective range of approximately 300 yards, and the rockets traveled at speeds near 265 feet per second. Beyond 100 meters, atmospheric factors such as gravity and wind significantly affected the trajectory of the projectiles, complicating accurate targeting. Consequently, Carpenter realized he needed to get incredibly close, closer than usual, to ensure his rockets would hit their target accurately. Since the bazookas were mounted at a 20-degree angle upward from horizontal, he would have to approach the enemy with precision, executing a carefully planned attack, fully aware of the risks involved. To accurately target something resting on the ground, Carpenter had to maneuver his small aircraft, yet another of the ingenious Grasshopper units, into a shallow dive, tilting the nose downward at roughly 30 degrees, perhaps a little more at 35. This disciplined adjustment was essential to achieve precise aiming, as he relied on sighting through the aircraft's small windshield, aligning his entire craft with the distant target. Once he was aligned, he prepared to fire at what was approximately 100 meters away, carefully ensuring that his aircraft was stable before pulling back on the stick to avoid alarming the enemy, namely the German infantry, with any abrupt movements that could betray his position or prompt them to open fire prematurely with their small arms. Before committing to the shot, Carpenter climbed to an altitude of about 200 feet, positioning his aircraft in such a way that he was south of the advancing German column, with the sun positioned behind him, providing a slight advantage in concealment and visibility. The German tanks, specifically the formidable Panther models, were making slow progress through the uneven terrain, their movement partially concealed by the lingering ground fog that still clung to the landscape. As Carpenter pushed the throttle forward, increasing power, he gently nosed the aircraft downward into a steep dive. The Grasshopper responded promptly, accelerating rapidly as it plummeted through the air, first reaching speeds of around 80 miles per hour, then climbing higher, eventually approaching 90 miles per hour as the fabric wings beneath him vibrated visibly due to the speed and aerodynamics. The roar of the wind caused the bazooka tubes mounted securely on the aircraft to scream, their high-pitched whine echoing through the air as the wind buffeted the small craft. From this vantage point, Carpenter's eyes became fixed on the advancing column of tanks below. He could now distinguish individual Panthers, tanks with their distinctive sloped turrets and side markings, and observe the movements of their commanding officers, who stood in their hatches, overseeing the slow progression through the terrain. His hand moved instinctively, arming the first of the launchers, carefully placing himself in the right-wing outboard position to maximize his chances of a successful shot. His thumb fell comfortably onto the firing switch, ready to unleash destruction. At approximately 150 meters, the lead tank, the immediate target, grew larger and more detailed in his windscreen, and he could discern the German crosses painted on the turret, a clear identification mark confirming its allegiance. With the target now at roughly 100 meters, Carpenter pressed the switch decisively. Instantly, the M6A3 rocket ignited with a sharp crack that reverberated through the aircraft, causing a brief jolt that shook the entire airframe. A torrent of exhaust flames, about 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit in temperature, blasted backward from the rocket, missing the fabric wing by mere inches, but enough to cause a noticeable gust of hot wind. The rocket streaked straight toward the Panther, trailing a trail of white smoke as it sped through the air, aimed directly at the tank's thinner top armor or possibly its engine compartment. Without waiting for confirmation of impact, Carpenter instinctively hauled back on the stick, aiming to force his small aircraft to climb away from the immediate danger zone. The overloaded aircraft responded sluggishly, too slowly for his expectations, but he persisted, pulling harder to gain altitude. The German infantry below reacted instantly once they saw the aircraft attacking, their small arms, machine pistols, and rifles firing hurriedly in his direction, their rounds snapping past him and hitting the fabric wings and tail section. One bullet managed to pierce the fabric of the left wing, while another struck the tail, leaving small puncture marks and tearing parts of the material. Despite this, Carpenter continued to ascend, determined to escape the increasing hail of gunfire. He was now at about 200 feet, then 300, steadily climbing as the firing from the ground dwindled and eventually ceased entirely. Reaching a stable altitude of approximately 800 feet, he turned his glance back to assess the outcome. The once-moving Panther had come to a stop, with smoke billowing from its engine deck, an indication that it was no longer operational but was also not entirely destroyed. The rocket's impact had likely damaged the vehicle's thinner armor on top, or perhaps the engine had been compromised, rendering it immobilized. The rest of the German column, seeing their main tank halted, broke into scattered defensive positions, some infantry rushing to establish cover or aim their weapons skyward, pointing at the aircraft and at the small cluster of allies with bazookas that had dared to strike a Panther tank. Carpenter was carrying 17 rockets in total, providing enough firepower to continue the attack or defend himself further. The Germans had clearly noticed the presence of observation aircraft and were no longer ignoring their threat, an indication that their earlier dismissiveness had shifted into awareness of the crucial role of air observation. As his mission approached its conclusion, Carpenter turned his aircraft northwestward, heading toward the nearby American airstrip at Lonville. His fuel gauge indicated there were approximately 9 gallons of fuel remaining, enough for another reload, possibly a couple of sorties if he stayed within friendly territory, leveraging the fuel reserve carefully. The bullet holes inflicted during the attack were minor. The small-caliber rounds had pierced the fabric without causing catastrophic damage. The wings and tail surfaces remained largely intact and responsive to control inputs. As he descended to around 100 feet to follow the terrain more closely, Brugger guided his aircraft along contours marked by trees and ridges, using the landscape itself as cover to evade further detection by the German infantry, who now knew that even small aircraft like his Cub could deliver significant bites of damage. With the ground rapidly approaching, Carpenter skillfully touched down at approximately 11:58, just before the propeller came to a complete stop. The ground crew were promptly rushing toward the aircraft, their attention drawn initially to the visible bullet holes scattered across the fabric surfaces. Their eyes then caught the absence of the second bazooka tube, realizing it had been used during the attack. One of the crew chiefs climbed onto the wing and carefully examined the spot where the rocket had been launched. The fabric around the launcher was scorched black from the heat of the rocket's exhaust, but remained undamaged. No burn-through had occurred. The metal tube itself had effectively channeled most of the exhaust gases away from the aircraft's wing surface, confirming that the design functioned just barely within safe limits. Reloading the launcher took approximately 14 minutes. During this time, 6 M6A3 rockets were slid into the launch tubes, each weighing about 3.38 pounds, bringing the total weight of the re-equipped system to roughly 19 pounds. This detailed and precise process of reloading was crucial for maintaining offensive capability during ongoing engagements, allowing Carpenter to continue striking targets and providing close air support despite the intense enemy fire and ongoing battle conditions. The rocket, measured at 4 inches in length, was equipped with a specialized blunt nose design, specifically engineered to prevent any deflection or deviation when it struck targets at low impact angles. This particular shape played a crucial role in ensuring the missile's effectiveness upon impact. The shaped charge warhead atop this missile was formidable, capable of penetrating between 3.5 to 4 inches of solid armor plating, an impressive feat that made it a significant threat to armored vehicles of that era. During the intense moments of the engagement, the crew chief turned to Carpenter with a question, wanted to understand what the missile had actually hit. It turned out that one of the Panthers had been successfully struck and rendered immobilized. The crew chief followed up by asking how close Carpenter's shot had been, in terms of distance, to the enemy vehicle. Carpenter replied that he had hit from 100 meters away, a remarkably close range for such a shot under combat conditions. The crew chief's reaction was one of disbelief, describing the shot as downright insane, reflecting the high level of risk and difficulty involved. Yet, Carpenter firmly maintained that the shot had been effective, affirming its success with a calm, confident tone. After that successful strike, Carpenter quickly resumed his flight, taking off once more. His aircraft was carrying a load of fuel amounting to about 11.7 gallons in total. Although the maximum fuel capacity was 12 gallons, the ground crew was unable to fully fill the tanks during the quick turnaround needed between sorties, mainly due to time constraints. Throughout both of his missions, Carpenter had launched a total of 18 rockets, 6 of which had already been expended, leaving him with 12 remaining for future action. Rising to an altitude of roughly 1,200 feet, Carpenter turned his aircraft eastward, heading toward the area called Arracourt. The weather conditions had improved since earlier, with the fog that had cloaked the battlefield mostly dissipated. Visibility had extended to about 5 meters, which, while still limited, was enough to expose the positions of German forces to the eyes of American aerial observers. Carpenter prepared his eyes to scan the landscape for any concentrations of enemy armor that might pose a threat. At approximately 12:41, Carpenter's sharp eyes picked up another formation of enemy vehicles moving along the terrain. He saw 8 Panther tanks advancing southward in a line along a tree-covered area east of a location known as Bazookas. Infantry units, following close behind, could be seen dismounted from half-tracks, vehicles that provided transport for infantry and supported their movement. This formation appeared to be more substantial than the first group he had encountered. It was likely comprised of elements from the 111th Panzer Brigade, attempting a maneuver to flank the American defenses. Recognizing the threat, Carpenter quickly relayed the precise coordinates of the enemy position to the command unit known as Combat Command A. Though the artillery units acknowledged the transmission, they explained that their response would take some time, as artillery fire depended on establishing ranges, adjusting fire, and walking shells onto the target, a process that couldn't be rushed when dealing with moving targets. Carpenter assessed that the enemy might have soon moved out of range before artillery shells could arrive. Consequently, he made a decision to engage the enemy immediately, foregoing the waiting period for support. He climbed to around 1,500 feet and prepared for a diving attack, planning to strike from the southwest direction. The sun was still behind him, providing some concealment and reducing the enemy's ability to spot him during his approach. The enemy tanks were spread across a stretch of approximately 400 yards on the road, giving him a sizable target area. Carpenter selected the lead tank for the upcoming attack, choosing to employ the same successful technique he had used before. He streamlined his aircraft's nose downward by about 35 degrees and began to accelerate in a controlled dive. Approaching the target at a range of 100 meters, he fired the rocket, which launched cleanly and accurately, his aim true once again. He pulled hard on the control stick to elevate the aircraft out of the dive, banking left to reposition himself for another pass. Almost immediately, he was met with the sound of heavier machine gun fire than during the first attack, tracers whizzing past his cockpit in a deadly arc. It was clear the Germans had learned from earlier encounters and had prepared defenses accordingly. Tracers streaked past in the dim light, some hitting close enough to cause concern. Suddenly, something hit the engine cowling with a metallic clang, producing a jarring impact that momentarily distracted him. The prototype Continental engine coughed once under the sudden strike, but despite the damage, it refused to shut down. Carpenter instinctively continued his maneuvers, circling wide at around 1,000 feet and glancing back to evaluate the damage. He saw that the lead Panther had come to a halt, smoke billowing from its engine compartment, an indication that it was immobilized, though not yet destroyed. The rest of the enemy formation had scattered, taking dispersed positions across the landscape, with some infantry dismounting from their half-tracks to set up makeshift anti-aircraft positions in the nearby fields. At this point, Carpenter had 11 rockets remaining in his payload. However, he recognized that the Germans were now actively hunting for him. Anticipating their response, he prepared for a second pass. He lined up his aircraft to dive again toward a Panther that had pulled off the main road into a field, arming his launcher for another strike. At a closing distance of approximately 120 meters, German infantry on the ground opened fire just as he was still descending, adding to the chaos. The sudden tremor caused by the rocket's launch made the aircraft shudder violently, and a fabric component behind him ripped somewhere in the rear of the fuselage, most likely from the intense vibrations and projectile impacts. Despite this, Carpenter pressed the trigger to fire another rocket. The missile streaked toward its target. He pulled the aircraft up sharply, aiming to confirm the hit visually, but he was still within range to see the enemy tank's fate. More tracers illuminated the scene, indicating the incoming fire from multiple directions. Suddenly, he felt a sharp impact through the rudder pedals, across his feet and legs, an unmistakable sign that his aircraft had been hit. At approximately 800 feet altitude, he leveled off, checking his instruments carefully to assess the extent of the damage. All readings appeared normal. Oil pressure was steady, and engine temperature remained within acceptable limits. However, he noticed that his aircraft's controls were not responding entirely as they should. The rudder felt mushy, sluggish, as if it had lost some of its usual responsiveness. Glancing back again, Carpenter saw the second Panther engulfed in flames, unmistakably destroyed, with fiery exits pouring from its turret hatches. The crew was seen bailing out amid the fire and smoke, an agonizing sight for the pilot. Yet, as he continued to observe the scene, he noted that tears in the fabric of his tail section were visible. These tears could have been caused by the enemy fire or possibly debris striking the aircraft during the chaotic engagement. Despite the damages, Carpenter remained airborne, focused on exit strategies and awaiting further instructions or opportunities to exploit the enemy's disarray. As Carpenter observed the unfolding scene, his eyes were drawn to a troubling sight. One of the aircraft's cables appeared frayed and worn, fraying at the edges, a vivid sign that disaster might be imminent if not addressed swiftly. The aircraft's rudder was responding to his commands, but the communication was sluggish and delayed, as if the controls were resisting his intentions, adding a layer of tension and uncertainty to an already precarious situation. Within moments, he noticed that two Panthers, formidable German tanks, had halted their advance abruptly, seemingly aware and cautious of the nearby American forces. Meanwhile, 11 rockets still remained in his arsenal, but only a handful of the enemy's heavy armor remained, a mere 10 rockets left to confront an increasingly hostile battlefield. Despite the damage sustained, Carpenter's aircraft was still airborne, but the injuries it had suffered were evident. The enemy Germans were busy establishing defensive anti-aircraft positions around their surviving armored units, clearly intent on denying the Americans any aerial advantage. With no other choice, Carpenter turned his aircraft westward, heading in the direction of the town known as Lawnville. The damage to his aircraft's rudder made precise, coordinated turns a challenge. He had to work diligently to compensate, overcorrecting with his ailerons to maintain a steady course. The aerodynamic instability caused his aircraft, affectionately named the Grasshopper, to want to slip sideways in its banks, a tendency that made maneuvers more difficult and demanded increased pilot skill and focus. Meanwhile, the fuel gauge indicated that his aircraft had approximately 7.2 gallons of fuel remaining, an amount just sufficient to reach their home base with a minimal safety margin. The engine was still running smoothly, operating predictably despite the adversity. Yet Carpenter noted that the oil temperature had climbed by 5 degrees above its normal operating range. While this was not yet critical, it suggested there might be a minor leak somewhere, perhaps from a round that had struck the engine cowling, causing slight internal damage. His mind quickly processed these details, aware that time was running out. Suddenly, the radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Combat Command A. The message relayed grave news. German armor had successfully bypassed the front lines, circumventing the forward positions, and had managed to trap a support crew from the 4th Armored Division at a water point located roughly 3 miles east of Arracourt. The detachment consisted of about 20 men arranged without heavy weapons or significant firepower, essentially vulnerable on their own. Their distress call was clear. They needed immediate assistance, any help that could be mustered to prevent a catastrophe and minimize losses. The German tanks, specifically the Panzer models, were closing in fast on the position, advancing relentlessly toward the stranded Americans. Carpenter carefully assessed his own position in relation to the unfolding crisis. He was approximately 4 miles away from the trapped American soldiers, 6 miles from the airstrip he called home, and with only 10 rockets remaining on his battered aircraft, which was barely holding together under the strain. The decision before him was stark and unambiguous. The sensible, tactical choice was to turn back, to retreat, land at the base, evaluate the damage, reload his weapons, and then return to the fight once his aircraft was fully operational again. Yet his mind also knew that delay could prove deadly. Reports indicated that the Panzer tanks were now dangerously close to reaching the American waterpoint crew, placing about 20 soldiers in imminent peril, potentially just minutes away from annihilation. Without hesitation, Carpenter spun the Grasshopper eastward and pushed the throttle forward with determination. The engine responded eagerly, responding to his commands as the aircraft gained speed. However, he observed with concern that the oil temperature was climbing another 3 degrees, a reminder that the aircraft's stress state was still perilous. He gradually descended to an altitude of approximately 500 feet, carefully following the terrain's natural contours to stay concealed and avoid detection. His eyes fixed on the transmitted coordinates from Combat Command A, guiding him toward the location of the trapped water point. By about 1,334 minutes past the hour, Carpenter spotted the target. A small, cleared area amid a cluster of trees where 5 trucks were parked, their wheels resting on the soft earth in a makeshift encampment. From his vantage point high above, he could distinguish American soldiers taking cover behind the vehicles, their figures crouched and alert, ready to defend themselves. But his attention was immediately drawn to the advancing enemy. 4 German Panther tanks, moving forward from the northeast, roughly 800 yards away from the American position. They were accompanied by infantry units, all moving in unison, tactically coordinating their assault. It was clear that the Germans had learned valuable lessons from previous encounters. This time, when Carpenter's aircraft drew near, the tanks suddenly ceased their movement. All 4 tanks halted abruptly, their turret guns swiveling in readiness, while the German infantry troops scattered into prepared defensive positions, seeking cover behind the tanks and nearby trees. Machine guns erupted in synchronized traverses skyward, their disguised barrels aiming in Carpenter's direction, signaling that the Germans were acutely aware of his presence and had prepared to intercept him. They had anticipated this aerial approach. This was no longer a surprise attack. It was an immediate threat, fully prepared and waiting. Carpenter realized that he faced a daunting, calculated defense. This would be a fierce gun battle, with him flying an unarmed observation plane crafted of fabric, hope, and bravery, vulnerable to the enemy's fire but committed to the mission. In response to the threat, Carpenter maneuvered the Grasshopper higher, climbing confidently to an altitude of about 18,100 feet, just beyond the effective range of small arms fire. It was a risky altitude, but potentially necessary to give himself some breathing room. From this vantage point, he saw the German tanks resume their slow and deliberate advance toward the trapped waterpoint crew, their massive forms creeping forward with calculated menace. The American soldiers, numbering about 20, had only a few precious moments before the tanks would reach them. Faced with a cruel dilemma, Carpenter's mind raced through his options. He could attempt an attack, risking being shot down and losing his aircraft, or he could circle uselessly in the skies while those 20 American soldiers faced imminent danger. His right hand moved swiftly over the controls, reaching for the firing switches. Without hesitation, he armed all his remaining rockets, a total of 10 explosive projectiles, preparing to unleash a lethal salvo that could turn the tide of the impending engagement. His plan was to fire all of his rockets in rapid succession during successive passes, praying that the Grasshopper could withstand the strain and that the remaining fuel and systems would hold long enough to make a difference. He initiated his first dive, tilting the aircraft 38 degrees nose down, hurtling toward the target area. The damage to his aircraft made this descent unstable. The damaged rudder struggled against his commands, and he had to fight the controls to maintain stability. Despite the turbulence, he pressed on, the aircraft racing at a speed of approximately 95 miles per hour. Each fraction of a second counted as he prepared for the critical moment, the strike that could potentially save those 20 Americans and turn the battle's momentum in his favor. The aircraft was trembling violently, rattling with an unsettling intensity that suggested something in the tail section was loose and vibrating furiously. The entire frame seemed to shudder as the sound of metal against metal echoed through the cockpit, a clear indication of ongoing structural distress. Ahead, Lead Panther's windshield was filled with a blur of movement and dust, momentarily obstructing the view, but emphasizing the chaos unfolding outside. Meanwhile, distant gunfire erupted from the German infantry positioned about 200 meters away, unleashing a barrage far earlier than they had previously anticipated. It was as if they had carefully studied his typical attack route and were now prepared to intercept him at an unexpected moment. Bright tracers, illuminating the darkening sky, converged in a deadly firestorm along his flight path, stitching a fiery web of bullets aimed directly at his aircraft. 150 meters from his current position, Carpenter quickly responded by firing 2 rockets from both launchers mounted on his craft. The recoil from each launch caused the Grasshopper to lurch and buck uncontrollably, forcing him to exert all his strength to keep control. In that moment, he instinctively pulled the stick upward, attempting to climb away from the incoming danger. However, the elevator control cable had been compromised during an earlier attack. It had frayed to the point where it was now partially unusable, making the aircraft's response sluggish and delayed. He felt the stick becoming mushy in his hands, further complicating his effort to regain precise control. Despite the response lag, Carpenter applied more force, pulling even harder on the control stick. Gradually, the nose of the aircraft responded, rising slowly, but it was painfully evident that it was not rising quickly enough. He was still below 400 feet above the ground as he soared over the German front lines. From the ground, gunfire erupted from every conceivable direction, creating a cacophony of noise and danger. The Grasshopper shuddered violently as multiple impacts struck its fuselage. Fabric tore apart, metal pinged against internal structures, and the aircraft shuddered under the relentless assault. Yet, even amidst all this chaos, Carpenter maintained his climb, pushing through the damage and chaos with unwavering focus. He reached 500 feet, then 600, all the while knowing that 2 rockets had impacted near the Lead Panther, striking close but not hitting directly. The resulting explosions hurled dirt and debris skyward, creating a cloud of dust that mixed with the smoke rising from the battlefield. Remarkably, despite the proximity of the blasts, the armored vehicle continued to inch forward, seemingly undeterred or perhaps only showing signs of temporary damage. Carpenter then leveled the aircraft off at 900 feet, trying to gain some stability in the worsening situation. However, the engine was clearly struggling. Its temperature gauge had climbed into the red zone, warning of an imminent failure, likely caused by a leak that might now be worsening. His fuel gauge indicated only 5.8 gallons remaining, an alarmingly low amount that wouldn't sustain a safe return if he remained in the area much longer. The tail section of his aircraft now felt dangerously loose, as if it could come loose entirely at any moment. With only 8 rockets left, Carpenter faced a grim situation. 3 Panthers advancing towards a group of 20 trapped American soldiers below. Worse yet, the Germans were no longer merely firing at him. They were actively coordinating their attacks. It was evident that they had studied his attack pattern and were waiting patiently for him to make his next move so they could eliminate him. Their anticipation was palpable. They were prepared for his next dive and ready to shoot him down without hesitation. He had only about 30 seconds to figure out a new plan before disaster struck. The Germans expected him to dive from high altitude, positioning their guns to cover exactly that approach. Meanwhile, the Panthers advanced steadily, closing the distance to barely 2,100 yards, moving directly toward the American water crew stationed nearby. On the ground, desperate American soldiers fired rifles at the advancing armored vehicles, an act of desperation that was ultimately futile against the heavy armor, but they continued trying nonetheless, hoping to slow or divert the enemy's progress. Carpenter recognized that he needed to approach from a different angle, something unexpected that the Germans wouldn't anticipate, something that could turn the tide of this dangerous engagement. So he decided to drastically change his altitude by dropping down to just 200 feet above the terrain, following the landscape closely in what was called terrain-following altitude, effectively placing him just below the effective range of organized anti-aircraft defenses. The Germans, however, had anticipated high dives. They had positioned their guns skyward, expecting him to approach from above and attack from that trajectory. Utilizing the cover of a distant tree line for concealment, Carpenter approached from the west at a speed of approximately 80 miles per hour. The aircraft's damaged elevator made maintaining level flight particularly difficult. The engine's temperature continued to climb into the red zone, and its oil pressure dropped dangerously low, a sign that serious mechanical failure was imminent. With minutes, perhaps only moments, before the Continental engine seized, he realized he was only 600 yards away from the advancing Panthers. In a quick, decisive move, Carpenter pushed the aircraft's nose upward to about 300 feet, then immediately nosed over into a steep dive, slanting steeply at around 40 degrees, more aggressive than his previous dives. This steeper attack angle meant that his bazooka rockets, mounted on angled launchers, would take a more direct path toward their targets, increasing their chances of hitting precisely where intended. The lead Panther, now only about 200 yards from the American water crew and their trapped comrades, caught sight of the approaching aircraft, and its crew swung their weapons toward it in readiness. Without hesitation, Carpenter armed 2 rockets, one from the outboard launcher on the left wing and another from the center launcher, both targeting the lead armored vehicle at an estimated range of 130 meters. The enemy infantry, noting his approach, raised their weapons in a last-ditch effort to shoot him down. They swung their guns toward him, but even as they did, Carpenter was already firing his rockets. Both launched simultaneously, creating a thunderous recoil that nearly stalled the Grasshopper in midair. He responded instinctively, shoving the throttle to maximum and yanking the damaged elevator back with all his might. The aircraft's nose responded sluggishly, but enough to clear the lead Panther by about 70 feet, narrowly escaping destruction once again in an underdog fight against overwhelming odds. Despite the damage and chaos surrounding him, Carpenter's quick thinking and aggressive tactics had allowed him to mount a new attack course, showing a rare combination of skill and daring under pressure, even as the threat of mechanical failure and enemy fire loomed large. Both rockets successfully struck their intended targets with devastating precision. One missile impacted the section of the turret ring, causing a significant jolt in the armor and compromising the tank's structural integrity. The second rocket penetrated the comparatively thinner armor located at the top of the engine compartment, which was less protected and more vulnerable to such high-velocity impacts. As a result, the formidable German tank abruptly came to a standstill amidst the chaos of battle. Flames erupted ferociously from the engine deck, engulfing the area in a blazing inferno that illuminated the battlefield with an ominous glow. The force of the explosion was so intense that the crew hatches were forced open violently, flung into the air as the crew members inside hastily scrambled to escape the inferno. These men, clad in their German uniforms, quickly evacuated the burning vehicle, some of them with their clothing smoldering and blackened from the heat. The destruction was clear and absolute. These tanks were no longer operational. They were confirmed to be completely destroyed. It's important to emphasize that these tanks had not simply been immobilized or incapacitated. They had been outright annihilated. The inferno raged, and the tanks burned fiercely, signaling the end of their threat on the battlefield. Meanwhile, Carpenter, observing the chaos, chose not to enter the burning wreckage. Instead, he remained at an altitude of approximately 300 feet, maintaining his position in the air. Immediately, he adjusted his course and turned sharply back toward the second Panther, which had not yet been destroyed. The confusion among the German forces became evident. Their anti-aircraft weapons and positions, which were earlier targeting potential aerial threats, now found themselves aimed at empty skies above, as Carpenter continued to attack from angles that their ground-based defenses did not anticipate. From his position, Carpenter armed 2 additional missile launchers, one mounted on the right wing's outer section and the other positioned centrally. As he prepared for another strike, he observed the second Panther maneuvering its turret to face toward the waterpoint position held by the American forces. The distance between Carpenter and the target was roughly 110 meters, a relatively close range for tank engagement. Without hesitation, Carpenter fired both rockets in quick succession and then executed a sharp, hard turn to the right, evading possible return fire from the tank's defenses. German infantry, close enough to the tanks, opened fire with machine guns, their rounds ripping through the left wing of Carpenter's aircraft. The gunfire damaged the fabric covering the wing, tearing it completely away from the front lift strut, exposing the internal framework. Despite the destruction on the surface, the wing itself held together stubbornly, barely maintaining its structural integrity, but ultimately remaining intact enough to keep the aircraft airborne. One of the rockets missed its target entirely, soaring harmlessly past. However, the other match struck the side armor of the second Panther's turret at an approximately 30-degree angle. This hit resulted in perfect penetration. The shaped charge detonated within the tank's turret, causing a secondary explosion that reverberated inside, igniting stored ammunition. The resulting blast lifted the turret about 6 inches and then settled it unevenly at an angle, while the crew inside scrambled to evacuate through the bottom hatch in a desperate bid for survival. The incendiary fire grew worse, and the tank was set ablaze, rendering it completely destroyed. Alongside it, another tank had also been obliterated in the blast, while 2 others continued to advance cautiously. The remaining Panther tanks were now approximately 500 yards from the American position. The infantry accompanying these tanks had gone into cover. Many sought refuge in the trenches or made efforts to conceal themselves in the terrain, some retreating altogether. These soldiers had witnessed the swift destruction of 2 Panthers within a span of only approximately 90 seconds, their faces marked by shock and determination. Carpenter quickly rearmed his missile launcher, loading 2 more rockets from his dwindling supply, which now totaled only 6 remaining after that successful hit. The engine of his aircraft was starting to suffer severe distress. It was trembling violently, producing metallic grinding sounds emanating from beneath the cowling. The temperature gauge had surged to its maximum point, indicating that the engine was overheating and nearing total failure. Time was running out. Carpenter knew he had only a brief window, perhaps one more attack run, before the engine would cease functioning altogether and leave him defenseless. With calculated urgency, he entered his 3rd dive on the target. His aircraft's nose pointed downward toward the smaller rear tank, which was partially obscured by the leading tank in the formation, complicating the shot. The range was now about 120 meters. Carpenter chose to fire only 1 rocket, conserving the remaining 5 for potential future use. His shot was aimed low, targeting the track assembly, and connected with a dull roar. The missile struck and caused the tank to swerve sharply to the left before grinding to a halt, completely immobilized but not yet an explosion or destroyed beyond repair. Its crew kept the engine running, their turrets still in motion, attempting to maintain control despite their apparent vulnerability. Meanwhile, the last of the German tanks, a Panther, was now only about 400 yards from a group of roughly 20 American soldiers, who were content to remain in their shelters, clutching their small arms, but knowing those weapons were largely ineffective against armored enemy vehicles. Carpenter's aircraft, now with only 5 rockets available and an engine on the brink of catastrophic failure, flew onward. Oil smoke was billowing from the damaged cowling, and the propeller vibrated so intensely that Carpenter could hardly see through the torn fabric wings of his aircraft. The crew at the water point, desperately trying to hold their position, were firing everything they had, small arms, machine guns, though their efforts proved futile against the heavily armored tank. As Carpenter maneuvered his failing aircraft toward the last remaining Panther, he glimpsed the approaching unit of tanks and soldiers. Less than 350 yards away, close enough that he could see individual figures behind the waterpoint trucks. These soldiers had ceased firing entirely, conserving their ammunition and braced for an inevitable onslaught. The turret of the final Panther began to traverse in the direction of the largest truck, preparing to deliver a decisive shot that could wipe out everyone within its blast radius with a high-explosive round. At that critical moment, Carpenter's engine seized unexpectedly, holding for just 2 seconds, a brief, ominous pause, before the propellers stopped spinning altogether. A deafening silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the soft whistle of the wind sweeping through the torn fabric wings of his aircraft. Then, inexplicably, the engine coughed back to life, grinding and rattling in its dying breaths. The engine struggled to keep going, making terrible noises, clattering, sputtering, dying but not quite dead yet. The aircraft still somewhat alive, still fighting against its impending failure. In the tense, orchestrated chaos of the battlefield, Carpenter meticulously prepared his attack. He loaded 3 rockets into the launcher, all still attached to the right wing of his aircraft, with deliberate precision. His plan was clear and uncompromising: to unleash all 3 rockets simultaneously in a single, devastating salvo. This execution was designed to maximize their combined destructive power, aiming to inflict the greatest possible damage in one swift, decisive strike. There would be no second chances, no opportunities to adjust or retreat. The mission demanded precision and speed, and Carpenter was intent on delivering it. As he descended, the Grasshopper, a nickname for his aircraft, lowered steadily to an astonishingly low altitude of 150 feet. This marked the lowest attack height it had yet attempted, a bold and dangerous tactic that left little room for error. Beneath him, the Panther tank, a formidable adversary, was stationary, concealed behind a slight rise in the terrain, with only its turret visible to the approaching Americans. From Carpenter's vantage point, he could see the full profile of the tank's hull, noting the thinner armor on the sides compared to its heavily protected front. The range between him and his target was approximately 140 meters, a distance within effective striking range, but still perilously close. However, the damage to his aircraft was evident. The elevator, responsible for controlling pitch, responded sluggishly, barely moving under his commands. Despite this, Carpenter carefully manipulated the throttle and ailerons in unison, attempting to aim his shaking, unstable aircraft as precisely as possible toward the target. The situation was tense. Every moment, every movement was critical. The Panther's commander, a vigilant soldier, stood in the hatch atop the turret, scanning the terrain for threats. His eyes locked onto the approaching aircraft, but, perhaps due to the suddenness of the attack, he was too late to react effectively. In a split second, Carpenter committed to his plan, releasing all 3 rockets simultaneously. The launch, powerful and unrelenting, almost tore the right wing clean off the aircraft due to the force and recoil generated. The sudden release caused the Grasshopper to yaw violently to the left, tumbling in an uncontrollable and violent roll as a result. Carpenter gripped the controls fiercely, fighting to regain stability amid the chaos. Miraculously, the wing held, and the aircraft began to realign. The 3 rockets converged their deadly payloads on the Panther within a span of just 2 seconds. The first rocket struck the side of the turret, penetrating the armor and causing immediate lethal damage. The second hit the upper part of the hull, also penetrating deeply, and the third slammed into the track assembly, detonating externally with devastating force. The combined effect of the 3 impacts was catastrophic. The ammunition stored within the tank exploded violently, unleashing a powerful internal blast that shook the entire vehicle. The force lifted the tank off the ground, caused the turret to detach entirely from the hull, which then split open along its seams. Secondary explosions erupted from the wreckage for no less than 15 seconds, a relentless cascade of destruction that left no doubt about the fate of the crew inside. All 4 Panthers in the vicinity were rendered completely out of commission, 2 destroyed outright, their hulls reduced to wreckage, and 2 immobilized, frozen in place by the explosion's fury. Despite the destruction around him, over 20 American soldiers managed to survive, some injured, some shaken but alive, thanks to Carpenter's precise and daring attack. Meanwhile, the crew at Waterpoint was already mobilizing, hurriedly loading trucks and preparing to evacuate. They moved swiftly, taking advantage of the chaos, while the German infantry scattered and faltered, caught off guard and disorganized in the aftermath. Carpenter knew he had made a significant impact, but also recognized the peril he faced. His aircraft was now about 3 miles away from their base, its engines sputtering and sputtering, with only approximately 1 minute of operational life left before total failure. Turning westward at full throttle, Carpenter pushed the engine to its maximum power. The sickening sounds emanating from the aircraft's engine, abnormal metallic rattles and shrill whines, were harbingers of imminent failure. The engine's internal components rattled noisily, and the oil-slicked windscreen obstructed his view. The temperature gauge had ceased functioning, likely shattered or damaged from overheating, providing no warning of the engine's true state. Despite this, the propeller kept turning, spinning through momentum and desperation, as if fighting to keep the aircraft aloft a little longer. Approximately 2 miles from Lonville, the engine abruptly ceased, biting off all power. It refused to restart, leaving Carpenter in an eerie silence. No engine noise, just the wind rushing past the unpowered aircraft. The Grasshopper had now become a glider, a craft utterly dependent on its aerodynamic shape and the pilot's skill. Yet, it was a very battered glider. The fabric covering the wings was torn, exposing the framework beneath, and the aircraft's mass was unevenly distributed, never designed for unpowered flight, especially in this damaged state. Carpenter carefully adjusted the controls to achieve the best glide speed, about 65 miles per hour, hoping to prolong his descent. His current altitude was approximately 800 feet, and he calculated that he could glide for around 2 minutes before reaching ground level, though damaged aerodynamics might reduce that time slightly. The aircraft was now about 1 mile from the airstrip, at roughly 400 feet of altitude. Through his windshield, Carpenter spotted the runway, and he could see the ground crew racing to position themselves for an emergency landing. His heart pounded as they moved into place, preparing for his arrival. Firefighting equipment was advancing, ready to extinguish any potential fires. However, the situation was critical. His altitude was rapidly dropping. The glide angle was such that he would not make it to the runway without additional altitude. He needed at least another 200 feet, an impossible wish given the circumstances. Near the runway, there was a field to the northeast, an expanse of plowed earth and soft ground. Not ideal, but safer than the surrounding forested area or trees. The terrain was rugged and unpredictable for landing gear, but represented his only viable option to avoid a catastrophic crash. Without the necessary altitude to reach the airstrip, Carpenter aimed his aircraft at this field, steering carefully, attempting to minimize damage and ensure survival. His altitude had now fallen to approximately 150 feet, and he guided the battered aircraft toward the open field, praying for a safe landing in this makeshift crash zone. On a clear day in late September of the year 1944, Major Carpenter found himself in a perilous situation that demanded every ounce of his skill, nerve, and quick thinking. As he soared over the battle-scarred landscape in his diminutive yet formidable L-4 Grasshopper, he felt the sudden loss of engine power, an unwelcome, ominous sign that his aircraft was rapidly losing altitude. Without any engine thrust to slow or control his descent, and with the damaged surfaces severely compromising his aircraft's maneuverability at the low speed he now found himself, he was faced with a stark reality. He was hurtling towards the earth, with less than 100 feet of altitude remaining. Below him spread the familiar terrain, tracts of fields and open ground, now seeing him approaching at an uncontrollable rate. When he was now down to a mere 50 feet, Carpenter instinctively grasped the stick with a gentle, steady pull, initiating the flare that would slow his landing. The aircraft responded sluggishly, but he managed to touch down with the tail wheel first, which was then followed by the main landing gear sinking into the soft, yielding earth. The input of the Earth's forgiving surface was immediate. Its gentle, moist grip caught the wheels and tugged the aircraft downward. The Grasshopper nosed over, upsetting the delicate balance, and the propeller suddenly bit into the mud, violently stopping its rotation and causing the aircraft to flip forward with a jarring thud. In an instant, the airplane came to rest upside down, its fuselage pressing into the ground beneath. Carpenter, tangled yet unhurt, found himself hanging upside down in his harness. The cockpit turned precariously above him. Fuel was leaking from the damage inflicted upon the aircraft's fuel tank, a rupture that rendered it a ticking hazard. The smell of gasoline, so intense and pungent, filled the confined space of the inverted cockpit. It was a dangerous, volatile vapor, hot from the engine's residual heat and ready to ignite at any moment. Carpenter's mind raced. He was acutely aware that he had mere seconds to act before the fuel vapors ignited, turning his fragile refuge into a deadly inferno. Summoning his courage, he unfastened his harness, causing him to swing downward onto the inverted roof of the cockpit. Tears of fuel seeped onto his flight suit, an oily, highly flammable substance that threatened his safety. He kicked at the side door, which was now jammed tight, its frame bent and warped from the crash impact, making escape difficult. Using his back against the seat for leverage, Carpenter delivered a forceful kick, causing the fractured door to break free from its mountings. With a frantic effort, he crawled out through the newly formed opening, rolled clear of the aircraft's wreckage, and swiftly got to his feet. Weak from the ordeal, he managed a hurried 20-yard dash before his legs, trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline, finally gave out. Within less than a minute, the ground crew arrived on the scene, their quick response crucial in preventing catastrophe. They deployed firefighting equipment that sprayed foam onto Rosie the Rocketer, effectively dousing the lingering fuel leak and halting the threat of ignition. Thanks to their swift action, the potential disaster was averted before the fuel vapors could ignite, saving Carpenter's life and many others. Medical personnel hurried to assess his condition, finding him to be only lightly injured. Scratches across his arms and minor cuts from the hurried rubble, bruises across his chest from the harness restraints, but nothing broken or severely damaged. Remarkably, Carpenter was unharmed by burns or fractures, an outcome he attributed not only to luck, but also to what he called simple mathematics. The discipline of staying low, attacking with speed, and never allowing the enemy a clear shot. This incident occurred amidst intense aerial combat over the battlefield that would be remembered as a vital chapter in the ongoing struggle. On that day, September 20th of the year 1944, Carpenter engaged in 3 daring sorties, expending a total of 18 rockets, an act of fierce determination and tactical ingenuity. His attacks contributed directly to halting the progress of nearby armored enemies, with 4 Panther tanks rendered useless, 2 destroyed completely, and 2 immobilized, their tracks or engines damaged beyond quick repair. Alongside this, 20 brave American soldiers were safely extracted from the front line, their lives preserved by these relentless efforts. Meanwhile, despite his successful sortie, Rosie the Rocketer, the aircraft bearing his call sign, met its own downfall, completely destroyed in the chaos. The engine seized due to relentless oil loss and damage from the intense heat, the wings torn beyond any possibility of repair, and the fuselage compromised structurally to the point of total loss. It was a write-off, a casualty of the harsh realities of war. Yet, even in such destruction, the fundamental concept proved its worth. Mounting bazookas on observation aircraft was a feasible, effective method for taking out tank targets from the air. The combat situation was critical, as the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A was fiercely resisting a heavy counteroffensive launched by the German 5th Panzer Army. Between September 18th and the 29th, Conflicting forces mobilized a staggering number of tanks and assault guns, 262, to regain the lost territory of Longueville and to eliminate the American bridgehead. German forces suffered significant losses, with 200 tanks either destroyed outright or severely damaged, a veritable toll that underlined the intensity of the engagement. For the Americans, the toll was somewhat lighter, 48 tanks lost, yet their forces endured tremendous pressure. The Battle of Arracourt emerged as the largest tank engagement on the Western Front during this period, until the climactic Battle of the Bulge 3 months later. Carpenter's relentless bazooka attacks during that crucial day disrupted German coordination at a pivotal moment when Allied forces were most vulnerable. His efforts played a part, however small it might seem on the surface, in shifting the tide of that confrontation. His valor and tactical mastery did not go unrecognized. 3 days following the incident, he was issued a new L-4H Grasshopper, the serial number 4330426. Identical in modifications, 6 M9 bazookas mounted, the same crew chief and the same call sign, Rosie the Rocketer, painted conspicuously on the cowling. Over the subsequent months, from September through December of that year, Carpenter flew an additional 63 bazooka attack missions, each fraught with danger, but also indicative of his unwavering resolve. Official records acknowledge that he was credited with the destruction of 6 tanks, specifically 2 Tiger tanks and 4 Panther or Panzer IV models, along with several armored cars and numerous soft-skin vehicles. Though eyewitness reports from ground units suggest the actual figure could have been significantly higher, possibly as many as 14 tanks taken out by his expert fire. Remarkably, throughout his service and despite the fierce aerial and ground combat, Carpenter's record remained pristine regarding injury. He had never received a wound, a fact that earned him the reputation of being extraordinarily fortunate among his peers. The ground crew, recounting his many feats, affectionately called him the Lucky Major, a nickname he modestly deflected by explaining it was simple mathematics. Lessons learned through brutal experience. Stay low, attack swiftly, and keep the enemy at bay by denying them any clear target. His actions and the success of the concept in practice proved that mounted bazookas on observation aircraft could indeed change the course of battles. It was a true testament to ingenuity and bravery, illustrating that even in the bleakest moments on the battlefield, clever tactics and unwavering courage could make all the difference. It was incredibly challenging to ascertain the precise moment when Carpenter launched his daring attacks on targets located many miles beyond the front lines of American forces, especially considering that he could never land his aircraft to confirm the destruction of enemy vehicles or positions. This gap in verification meant that much of what was believed to have been destroyed was based on the aggressive tactics and the boldness of each sortie rather than concrete proof. Several other pilots flying the L-4 Grasshopper, a small reconnaissance aircraft often covered with fabric, attempted to implement similar modifications to their planes in hopes of increasing their effectiveness for ground attack missions. However, most of these pilots quickly abandoned these experimental tactics after just a single combat mission. They recognized that diving a lightweight, fabric-covered observation plane directly into areas saturated with anti-aircraft fire was, statistically speaking, an almost certain recipe for disaster. The dangers were simply too great, and the chances of survival too slim to justify continuing such risky endeavors. Lieutenant Harley Merrick and Lieutenant Roy Carson, 2 of the pioneering individuals responsible for the development of the so-called bazooka attack techniques, ultimately decided to revert to the standard reconnaissance duties. After successfully destroying 2 enemy trucks with their new tactics, they concluded that the danger involved had begun to outweigh the tactical advantages they hoped to gain. They recognized the peril and chose safety over further risk. In stark contrast, Carpenter disagreed with this decision and believed that relentless pursuit and aggressive action were worth the danger. He continued to attack German armor a further 63 times after the 25th of September. The unwavering determination with which Carpenter engaged enemy tanks and vehicles drew national attention. In October, the Stars and Stripes newspaper featured an interview with him, seeking to understand his motivations and resolve. When asked why he persisted in such dangerous attacks, Carpenter explained that the war required constant vigilance, that the fighting had to be fought around the clock throughout all 24 hours of each day and in every minute within those hours. His philosophy was straightforward: strike, strike again, and keep attacking relentlessly. His fearless approach forced the German forces to alter their tactics and operational doctrines. Before September, the Germans had largely disregarded the small, unarmed observation planes like the Cubs, considering them insignificant and non-threatening. However, after Carpenter's persistent assaults, standing orders were issued that mandated all ground units to engage with NEL for aircraft encountered on site. German infantry and tank commanders took precautions by deploying dedicated anti-aircraft weapons to protect their vehicles. They even stationed spotters expressly tasked with watching for small aircraft like the Cubs with tubes attached to their wings, which carried the tiny yet deadly weapons that Carpenter used so effectively. The Germans gave Carpenter a nickname, Der Veruca Major, which was a play on his last name and a reference to his perceived cunning and unpredictability, and the Mad Major, reflecting his audacious, perhaps even reckless, style of warfare. Carpenter accepted the moniker with a measure of pride, acknowledging that some degree of madness was undoubtedly necessary when one was fighting tanks capable of destroying Shermans at a range of 1,200 yards. Throughout the campaign, Carpenter's unit, the 4th Armored Division, advanced eastward across France, pushing closer to the German border. During this period, Carpenter not only flew reconnaissance and attack missions, but also served as the personal pilot for General John S. Wood, accompanying him during troop movements and other operations. By December, the Third Army had driven deep into enemy territory, reaching the locations close to the German border itself. Over the course of his service, Carpenter had completed a total of 110 combat sorties, an extraordinary number considering the dangerous nature of his missions. Despite flying unarmed observation aircraft straight into heavy anti-aircraft fire on numerous occasions, he was never wounded nor shot down by enemy action. An incredible feat, the barrage of enemy fire was relentless, yet he survived every attack and every challenge, demonstrating extraordinary skill and resilience. Then, as the year 1945 dawned, a different battle began within Carpenter's own body. He fell ill, and medical examinations revealed that he was suffering from Hodgkin's lymphoma, a form of cancer considered terminal. Early in 1945, doctors delivered grim news. The prognosis was that Carter could expect at most 2 more years of life, a disheartening verdict given his age of just 32 years at the time. Despite having survived over 100 combat sorties, never suffering a wound during countless high-risk attacks, the insidious illness would ultimately prove to be his most formidable adversary, something that even German Panther tanks, known for their ferocity and resilience, had failed to defeat. In recognition of his valor and extraordinary heroism, the Army promoted Carpenter to the rank of lieutenant colonel and awarded him several prestigious decorations. These included the Silver Star for Valor, the Bronze Star with an oak leaf cluster, and the Air Medal with an oak leaf cluster. Official records credited him with the destruction of 6 tanks, the disabling or destruction of 17 armored vehicles, as well as the elimination of dozens of less heavily armored, soft-skinned targets. His citations praised his unparalleled courage, his complete disregard for personal safety, and his relentless dedication to the cause. Behind these accolades, however, was a man driven by a deep conviction that war must be fought aggressively or not at all, a belief shaped by his background as a high school history teacher who passionately believed in the importance of fighting with resolve and purpose. In June of 1946, Carpenter received an honorable discharge from the Army and returned to his hometown of Urbana in Illinois. He resumed his previous profession as a high school teacher, stepping back into the familiar role of guiding and educating teenagers, sharing lessons about the battles and heroism he had personally witnessed and participated in during the war. His wife, Elda, had patiently waited for his return, and together they looked forward to rebuilding their life. Their daughter, Carol, was then only 7 years old. a young girl eager to see her father again and to hear about his adventures. Carpenter had only about 2 years remaining, according to the prognosis of the military doctors, and he was determined to spend every one of those precious months at his profession, teaching and inspiring his students, passing on the lessons of resilience and courage that had marked his wartime experience. By the year 1948, astonishingly, Carpenter was still alive and actively teaching in Urbana. Despite the grave medical predictions, he had defied the odds, continuing his work in the classroom, sharing his stories, and shaping the minds of the next generation. His resilience and dedication became a testament to his character, a man who fought fiercely not only on the battlefield but also in his own life, never losing hope even as his body fought against him with unrelenting severity. In the year 1950, Charles Carpenter was still alive, defying the grim prognosis that had once predicted only a brief span of survival after his diagnosis. For years later, in 1955, he remained among the living, continuing to outride any expectations that modern medicine had initially set for him. As time passed, the original 2-year survival estimate gradually expanded into 5, then 10, then 15 years, illustrating how his case challenged the incomplete understanding of Hodgkin's disease during the 1940s. Medical science at that time lacked the comprehensive insights into this particular cancer's progression, resulting in many patients facing early deaths based on limited data. Surprisingly, some individuals, like Carpenter, exceeded even the most optimistic predictions, living multiple years beyond what was ever anticipated by the medical professionals of that era. Charles Carpenter's story became one of remarkable resilience and resistance against the seemingly inevitable. He was, after all, a man who had been told he wouldn't live long, yet he defied those odds, living 21 years after the initial diagnosis. During this period, he also took on a new role and a new purpose beyond his previous life, dedicating himself to teaching history at Urbana High School. For 2 full decades, Carpenter shared his knowledge and passion for the past with students, all the while quietly challenging the notion that his life was nearing its end, a narrative that had once seemed predetermined and unchangeable. The persistence of his life, spanning nearly 2 decades past the predicted 2-year mark, stood as a testament not only to his personal strength, but also to the uncertain and evolving understanding held by the medical community during the 1950s. On the 22nd of March in the year 1966, Charles Carpenter passed away, leaving behind a legacy that had defied the odds in ways few could imagine. He was 53 years old at the time of his death, 21 years after the diagnosis that had initially cast a shadow over his future, and 19 years beyond the original prognosis of merely 2 years. His life had been an extraordinary journey, marked by resilience, determination, and an almost stubborn refusal to succumb to illness. As he was laid to rest in Edgington Cemetery in Illinois, his gravestone bore the simple inscription of his rank, Lieutenant Colonel, a reminder of a life dedicated to service and bravery. The stone made no mention of the nicknames that had once followed him: Bazooka Charlie, Rosie the Rocketer, or the Mad Major, elements of his story that had become legendary in certain circles, but which were omitted from the official marker. Instead, it simply displayed his name, his dates of birth and death, and his military service. The aircraft associated with Charles Carpenter, known as the L-4 Grasshopper, disappeared after the war, and most assumed it had either been scrapped or lost to history entirely. However, years later, in 2017, aviation historians made a startling discovery. The plane featured in the collection of the Austrian Aviation Museum at Graz Airport. For decades, it had been quietly flying within a civilian flying club in Vienna, its previous history largely unknown to all but a handful of specialists. No one realized that this very aircraft had once been Rosie the Rocketer, the tiny yet formidable airplane that had played an unexpected role during the tumultuous days of 1944. Its contributions had been significant but overshadowed by the chaos and destruction of the war. In 2018, the Collings Foundation acquired the aircraft and initiated a meticulous restoration process. The same Grasshopper that had tirelessly attacked German tanks, destroying Panther tanks with precision and courage, was destined to take to the skies once more. Despite its remarkable wartime service, the original model of the L-4 with the mounted bazookas proved too vulnerable to be used in sustained combat operations, leading to its replacement by more advanced technologies, such as helicopters for observation and dedicated ground attack aircraft for combat missions. The improvised weapon systems like Carpenter's bazooka-equipped aircraft gradually disappeared from the battlefield. Yet, in the fleeting but pivotal months of 1944, when American tank crews faced devastating losses against the heavily armored German tanks, an unlikely hero emerged. A history teacher from Illinois, Charles Carpenter, sacrificed himself at the controls of his tiny observation plane, risking his life by flying through anti-aircraft fire, simply because someone had to do something. For a brief but critical window, he demonstrated that even the smallest aircraft, armed with ingenuity and courage, could make a difference in the fierce battles of that era. If this story resonated with you, as it moved us immensely, I ask you to consider supporting the preservation of such stories. Each gesture, every like, serves as a signal to broader audiences that these moments of heroism deserve recognition. Every single like encourages platforms like YouTube to share these tales with more viewers, spreading the stories of bravery and ingenuity. At the same time, we invite you to deepen your connection by reflecting on your own roots. Perhaps someone in your family served in the military, or you yourself have a personal story of resilience. Please take a moment to share with us where you're watching from, whether it's the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or any other part of the world. Our community is truly global, and through these shared stories, we help keep alive the memory of men like Charles Carpenter. Men whose courage and unconventional heroism made a difference in critical moments of history. Remember, you are not just a viewer. You're a vital part of a collective effort to honor the sacrifices and bravery of individuals who, many times, operated in obscurity, but whose actions echoed through history. Your voice and your engagement help ensure that the legacy of this remarkable man and others like him will continue to be remembered, celebrated, and passed down through generations to come.